My son's new camera hit the fountain at 4:17 that afternoon. My name is Mallory Carter Brooks, and I was 38 years old when I watched my niece destroy the birthday gift my son had spent months dreaming about. Ethan ran toward the water, but my husband caught him before he slipped over the stone edge. My niece did not gasp, apologize, or even pretend to be surprised. She simply watched the camera disappear beneath the moving water. My father called it an accident. My sister accused me of humiliating her child. When I demanded repayment, my father pointed toward the exit and shouted, "Get out, you selfish jerk!" So I opened my banking app and canceled the $2,000 I had been sending toward his rent every month. I told him the next payment was his responsibility. 7 hours later, just after midnight, he appeared outside my house. He rang the bell, called my phone, shouted my name, returned to his car, and came back again. He stayed outside for 3 hours, and what he finally admitted explained why my sister had never believed consequences applied to her. Before I tell you what kept my father outside until 3 in the morning, tell me, what time is it where you are? Where are you watching from? And how much loyalty do you owe relatives who refuse to protect your child? 10 hours earlier, I was carrying Ethan's birthday cake into the old streetcar depot we had rented for the afternoon. The depot had been converted into a small transportation museum, but its original brick walls, ticket windows, and brass signs were still intact. It was exactly the kind of place Ethan loved, because every room felt like a story waiting to be documented. My full name is Mallory Carter Brooks. I was 38, the younger of two sisters, and a senior restoration project manager for a Columbus company that rehabilitated historic theaters, libraries, schools, and public buildings. At work, I handled damaged roofs, collapsed plaster, delayed permits, and contractors who swore a missing shipment would arrive tomorrow. I had learned how to separate facts from excuses. Inside my own family, however, I had spent years ignoring facts, because accepting them would have meant admitting that generosity had turned into obligation. My husband, Nolan Brooks, was arranging chairs near the restored ticket counter while our son, Ethan, checked the gift table for the third time. Ethan had turned 13 that morning. He was thoughtful, cautious, and far more observant than most adults realized. He never enjoyed being the center of attention, but he loved watching the way people moved through a room. Photography gave him a reason to notice details others missed: the nervous way someone touched a wedding ring, the faded lettering above an abandoned shop, the sunlight crossing a cracked school window. His media arts teacher, June Hollis, had encouraged him to enter a regional student documentary competition. The theme was "What Our City is Losing," and Ethan had chosen to document neighborhood landmarks that were disappearing before people understood why they mattered. For 4 months, he had borrowed an old-school camera with a loose battery door and a lens that sometimes refused to focus. He never complained. He taped the battery cover, cleaned the scratched glass, and learned to work around every limitation. June told us that his patience behind the camera was unusual for his age. He did not rush people, interrupt interviews, or chase dramatic footage. He waited until people forgot he was recording, which allowed them to speak honestly. Nolan and I decided to buy him a mirrorless camera, a good lens, an extra battery, and a hard, protective case. It was the most expensive birthday gift we had ever given him, but it was not a status symbol. It was equipment for a project he had already earned the right to finish. The depot was perfect for the party. The main hall held long tables, a small screening wall, and a display of restored streetcar seats. Beyond the glass doors was a paved courtyard with a shallow decorative fountain running through dark stone channels. I had paid for the venue, food, decorations, and museum tour myself. I did not resent paying. I had invited people because Ethan wanted one afternoon when both sides of the family could gather without arguing. Looking back, that hope was the first unrealistic gift of the day. My father, Howard Carter, arrived early and asked whether the coffee was included in the rental. He was 68, retired from warehouse supervision, and still capable of supporting himself if he lived carefully. Almost 3 years earlier, he had told me he needed temporary help qualifying for a 2-bedroom apartment near his doctor's and favorite grocery store. I agreed to send $2,000 directly to the property account every month. Howard promised the arrangement would last 6 months. 6 months became a year. A year became nearly 3. Each time I raised the subject, there was another reason he needed more time: medical co-pays, rising utilities, car repairs, or a promise that he would move after the holidays. I was not a tenant, guarantor, or co-signer. I was simply the daughter who kept paying. My older sister, Danielle Carter, treated that payment as proof that I had accepted responsibility for the entire family. Danielle was 42 and separated from her husband. She described every problem as temporary, even when it had lasted for years. Her daughter, Brielle, was 12 and had developed a pattern of targeting Ethan whenever attention moved away from her. Danielle defended her before anyone finished describing what happened, and Howard praised Brielle as strong-willed while calling Ethan sensitive. 6 months earlier, Brielle had deleted the final version of a school video from Ethan's tablet. She claimed she thought it was an unused file. Howard said Ethan should have created a backup. At Christmas, she twisted Ethan's headphones until one side cracked. Danielle said Brielle had only been trying them on, and Howard told me children broke things. In both cases, Ethan was expected to forgive immediately, while Brielle was never expected to repair anything. Danielle arrived 40 minutes late with Brielle. They brought no food, card, or gift. Danielle announced that traffic had been terrible, then complained that the museum parking lot was too far from the entrance. Brielle barely acknowledged Ethan until Nolan carried the wrapped camera box toward the center table. Then she stepped closer than anyone else. Ethan opened the box carefully. When he saw the camera image printed on the packaging, he looked at Nolan and then at me. "Is this really mine?" Nolan smiled. "Every part of it. But let me set up the memory card and firmware before anyone uses it." Brielle held out her hand. "Let me try it first." Ethan kept both hands around the box. "Not yet. Dad hasn't set it up." Danielle laughed as if he had told a joke. "Don't be possessive. She only wants to see it." Nolan answered calmly. "It belongs to Ethan. He gets to decide who handles it." Brielle's face tightened. Danielle rolled her eyes and said we were teaching Ethan to value objects more than people. Before I could respond, a catering employee called me to the warming station because an outlet had failed. I was gone less than 2 minutes. When I turned back, the protective case was open and empty. Ethan stood beside the table, staring through the glass doors. Outside, Brielle was walking toward the courtyard with the camera held against her chest. By the time I reached the patio door, Ethan was already running toward the fountain. Brielle stopped beside the water with the camera in both hands. Ethan called her name and told her to give it back. She turned, looked directly at him, lifted the camera over the stone channel, and opened her fingers. No one bumped her. She did not stumble. The camera dropped straight into the moving water. Ethan lunged forward. Nolan caught his arm before he could lose his footing on the wet stone, then stepped with him to the edge. The fountain was only 18 inches deep, so Nolan reached down and pulled the camera out safely. Water streamed from the lens mount, battery compartment, and buttons. Ethan held the soaked strap as though gripping it tightly enough might reverse the last few seconds. He did not scream. That was the part I remembered most clearly. He looked at me and asked, "Mom, can it be fixed?" I removed the battery, placed the camera on a dry bench, and faced Brielle. "Why did you do that?" She shrugged. "It slipped." Ethan shook his head. "No, it didn't." She held it over the water. She looked at me first. Danielle rushed outside and positioned herself between Brielle and the rest of us. "Stop accusing her because you didn't want to share." Several guests went quiet. One cousin gently moved her young children away from the fountain. Another relative offered towels, then stopped speaking when Danielle glared at him. The museum guide stood near the doorway, uncertain whether to intervene. Everyone had seen enough to know this was not a simple accident, but most of them also knew how quickly Danielle and Howard could make honesty feel like aggression. Howard stepped onto the patio and ordered me to stop embarrassing Brielle. He did not ask whether Ethan was all right. He did not look at the camera. He focused entirely on my tone. I asked Danielle to pay for a professional inspection and replace the equipment if the technician confirmed it was ruined. She folded her arms. "You can afford another one. Why should I pay thousands because two children argued?" "They didn't argue," I said. "Your daughter took his gift after he said no and dropped it into a fountain. She borrowed it. She removed it from a closed case without permission." Danielle said I was choosing the most dramatic interpretation because I enjoyed feeling superior. I reminded Howard that Brielle had damaged Ethan's belongings before. He waved his hand and told me that family mattered more than a camera. "Protecting Ethan is a family matter," I answered. I asked Brielle one more time whether she had done it intentionally. Danielle answered for her, saying the question itself was cruel and that Brielle was already frightened by the adults surrounding her. Brielle did not look frightened. She looked bored. Howard told me to let it go before I ruined the party. I said the party had already been ruined when everyone watched a child destroy another child's gift and decided my reaction was the real offense. Danielle said Brielle was under stress because of the separation and that a compassionate aunt would understand. I told her compassion did not mean forcing Ethan to absorb mistreatment without an apology, repair, or consequence. Nolan stood beside Ethan and placed one hand on his shoulder. "Brielle needs to apologize, and Danielle needs to cover the damage. That is the reasonable solution." Howard snapped that Nolan should stay out of Carter family business. Nolan's expression changed. "Ethan is my son. This is my business." Howard raised his voice and ordered me to lower mine. He said I had always used money to control people and was now humiliating Danielle because I enjoyed reminding everyone that I earned more. I asked which money he meant: the venue, the catering, the birthday gift, or the monthly rent payment that allowed him to stand in a party I funded and tell me my son's feelings were inconvenient. His face hardened. "Get out, you selfish jerk!" The words echoed through the depot. Conversations in the main hall stopped. Ethan stared at the ground. Danielle looked pleased, as though Howard had finally said what she had been waiting to hear. "I paid for this room," I said. Howard stepped closer. "Then take your money and leave. If you use it to shame your sister, you are not welcome around me." For years, I had feared being called selfish more than I feared being used. That afternoon, the word finally lost its power. I opened my banking application, selected the recurring transfer marked Dad's Rent, and changed the amount from $2,000 to $0. A confirmation appeared on the screen. I held it where Howard could see it. "Perfect. Your next rent payment is your responsibility." Danielle laughed too quickly. "You're bluffing." "You're welcome to test that theory." Howard's face went pale. He said I could not make housing decisions during an argument. I reminded him that I had not changed his lease, taken his money, or removed anything that belonged to him. I had stopped giving him mine. Nolan wrapped the camera in dry towels, saved the memory card separately, and told the museum staff we would return for the remaining decorations. I gathered Ethan's cards and thanked the few guests who had quietly asked whether he was okay. We left before Howard could turn the confrontation into another lecture. In the car, Ethan held the empty camera case on his lap. After 10 silent minutes, he whispered, "I shouldn't have opened it in front of everyone." He believed his happiness had caused the attack. I turned in my seat and told him the gift was his. His excitement was not a provocation, and Brielle's decision was not his responsibility. Before we reached home, Howard called. His name filled the dashboard screen. I let the phone ring. The call stopped at 11:30, and for 20 minutes the house was finally quiet. By then, Howard had called 16 times, Danielle had sent 9 messages, and 3 relatives had asked me to be reasonable without asking how Ethan was doing. Nolan and I placed the camera on towels beneath the kitchen light. He removed the lens, battery, and memory card. The memory card might survive. The camera body almost certainly would not. Ethan stood at the end of the counter. Is Grandpa angry with me? Grandpa is angry because I stopped doing something he expected me to do, I said. That is not your responsibility. Did you really cancel his rent? I canceled my payment. His rent still exists. He looked at the wet case. I don't want him to lose his apartment because of me. The speed with which he accepted blame frightened me more than Howard's anger. I told Ethan that adults were responsible for their own housing decisions. Howard had received nearly 3 years of help, and I had the right to stop when that help was used to excuse cruelty toward my child. Kindness stopped being kindness when someone demanded it as payment for silence. At 11:45, Nolan took Ethan upstairs. We told him he did not need to think about the camera again that night. He left the damaged case on the kitchen table and went to bed without asking to open his other gifts. At 12:07, the doorbell rang. My phone showed Howard beneath the porch light. He leaned close to the camera. Mallory, open the door. I came to apologize. Nolan stood beside me while we watched from the hallway. I did not answer. Howard rang again. Then he called my phone twice. Within minutes, the apology began changing shape. He said I had misunderstood him. He said everyone had been emotional. He said the apartment office might receive notice that the recurring payment had been canceled. Then he admitted something he had hidden for months. Danielle and Brielle were living with him full-time. Danielle had not stayed for a few nights after her separation. She had moved into his second bedroom nearly 5 months earlier. Howard said the office had already questioned the additional occupants. Without my payment, he said, all 3 of them could lose the apartment. You're putting your sister and a child on the street, he shouted through the door. I pressed the speaker once. Leave my property. Communicate with me in writing. You will open this door and talk to your father. I am telling you to leave. I turned off the microphone. For the next hour, Howard rang every few minutes, called my phone, walked toward his car, and returned. His messages shifted from apology to command, then to guilt. He said my late mother would be ashamed. He said the neighbors would think I was heartless. He said Ethan needed to learn forgiveness. He never said Brielle had been wrong. At 1:20, he called Nolan and left a voicemail telling him to control his wife before she destroyed the family. Nolan saved it instead of replying. We turned off the downstairs lights and watched the security feed on a tablet from the kitchen. Howard paced across the porch, checked the windows, and repeatedly called my name. Lights appeared in 2 neighboring houses. At 2:10, he walked toward our side gate. Our neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, saw him from her upstairs window and contacted community security. 2 officers arrived shortly after 3. Howard insisted it was a private family disagreement and that he had the right to speak with his daughter. One officer asked whether he lived in the house. No, but she is my daughter. Did she tell you to leave? Howard said I was emotional and did not mean it. I confirmed through the doorbell speaker that I had told him to leave nearly 3 hours earlier. The officers documented the complaint and issued a trespass warning. One asked whether Howard had medication, personal belongings, or any legal reason to enter. He admitted he did not. The officer told him that a family relationship did not cancel a homeowner's direct order to leave. Howard finally walked toward his car, but before getting inside, he turned and shouted, "You chose a camera over your own father." A floorboard creaked above us. Ethan stood halfway down the stairs. He had heard enough. He stared at the dark screen after Howard drove away. "Why didn't Grandpa say anything about what Brielle did?" he asked. "Why was every word about the money?" By 7 the next morning, Danielle had already rewritten the entire night. She sent a long message to the extended family claiming I had canceled an elderly man's housing over a childish accident. In her version, Brielle dropped the camera while returning it. Ethan exaggerated because he disliked sharing, and I used my income to threaten relatives who were struggling. She omitted the fountain, Brielle's history, Howard's order to leave my own event, and the 3 hours he spent outside my house. Relatives contacted me before breakfast. Some were openly angry. Others used gentler language to demand the same thing: restore the payment and stop making the family uncomfortable. One uncle said I should consider the camera a lesson in sharing. A cousin admitted Danielle's story sounded incomplete, but asked me to give in because Howard was exhausting everyone. That sentence told me more than she intended. They did not believe he was right. They wanted me to surrender because I was easier to pressure. I did not debate them individually. Nolan and I saved the family messages, call logs, doorbell recordings, and voicemails. I wrote a timeline while every detail was fresh. At 9:15, Tessa Monroe, the manager at Howard's apartment complex, called. She had received notice that the recurring contribution was canceled and wanted confirmation. It was intentional, I said. Tessa explained that I was not a tenant, guarantor, or co-signer. I had been making voluntary third-party payments and had no legal duty to continue. Howard had repeatedly described my contribution to relatives as if I had signed a permanent obligation. The lease showed otherwise. Then Tessa asked whether I knew Danielle and Brielle were living there. Howard had received 2 notices about unauthorized occupants. The account also had unpaid utility charges after water and electricity use increased. His lease was not ending immediately, but renewal would depend on income verification, occupant approval, and payment of the balance. My canceled transfer had not created the crisis. It had exposed one Howard was already hiding. An hour later, Marcus Bell, the museum's operations director, contacted me about the incident report. A camera covered the courtyard, and he asked whether I wanted the footage preserved. Nolan came with me that afternoon. The first recording showed Brielle leaving the hall with the camera secure in both hands. She walked directly to the fountain, paused, turned toward Ethan, raised the camera, and released it. A second angle showed Danielle near the glass doors. She saw where Brielle was going but did not call her back until after the camera entered the water. There was no slip. Marcus provided a certified digital copy and a written report. When Danielle texted that children remembered stressful events incorrectly, I sent one sentence: the courtyard cameras recorded everything. Her replies stopped for 40 minutes. When she answered, she claimed the footage had no audio and could not prove Brielle's feelings. I replied that feelings did not change the visible act. Howard then sent a series of angry messages admitting Danielle could not replace the camera because he had already helped with her vehicle payment, legal expenses, and groceries. I finally understood the arrangement. My $2,000 had freed Howard's pension so he could redirect his own money to Danielle. I had not simply been supporting my father. I had been financing his favoritism from a distance. That evening, June Hollis called because Ethan had withdrawn his documentary from the competition. She offered temporary school equipment and said his work deserved to continue whenever he felt ready. I bought a replacement camera, but Nolan and I gave it to Ethan privately. Replacing this does not erase what happened, I told him. You do not have to pretend it was harmless. He asked whether accepting the new camera meant Brielle had gotten away with it. No. Restoring what you lost is our responsibility as your parents. Accountability is a separate decision. Nolan recovered the footage from the original memory card, including Ethan's first interviews. When Ethan saw that his work had survived, he covered his face for a moment and then asked whether June would still let him enter. She did. I sent Danielle a written demand for the camera body, lens, professional inspection, and any filing costs. She replied, Successful people are supposed to help relatives who have less. I answered that voluntary help was not permission to destroy property. Her final message read, "I will never pay you willingly." 3 weeks later, Danielle walked into Franklin County Municipal Court still calling the footage misleading. I had filed a small claims action for the camera body, damaged lens, inspection, and filing expenses. I did not sue Brielle. She was a child. The adult responsible for correcting the harm was her mother. Danielle represented herself. Howard sat behind her and stared at me through the entire wait. Danielle brought printed family messages, apparently believing relatives' opinions about my income were evidence. The judge set most of them aside. When the case was called, Danielle argued that the camera was an unnecessarily expensive gift for a 13-year-old. She said children could not understand professional equipment and claimed I had created jealousy by giving Ethan something designed to make everyone else feel poor. I explained Ethan's documentary, June's recommendation, and the months he had spent borrowing unreliable school equipment. I submitted the purchase receipt, the technician's report, Marcus Bell's incident statement, and both security recordings. The judge watched the footage twice. At first, Danielle said Brielle had lost her grip. When the pause and deliberate release became impossible to ignore, she changed her explanation. Brielle had not understood the value, she said. The judge answered that the case was not about whether Danielle approved of the gift or whether I could afford another one. It was about documented property damage and a parent's refusal to reimburse the owner. The court entered judgment for $2,964, payable through monthly installments. The judge explained that the schedule made repayment manageable, not optional. In the hallway, Howard asked me to withdraw the judgment because Danielle could not afford court payments and new housing. "Her difficulty does not make the cost mine," I said. Howard followed me toward the elevator and said I was punishing Danielle for being less successful. I told him this had never been a contest between sisters. Danielle had been offered several chances to apologize, arrange an inspection, or propose repayment before I filed anything. She had rejected every option because she expected my income to erase her responsibility. Howard lowered his voice and asked what relatives would think when they learned I had taken my own sister to court. I said they were free to read the evidence. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the old family method would not work. He could no longer pressure me privately, then describe my surrender publicly as proof that Danielle had done nothing wrong. The apartment issue moved separately. Tessa later confirmed that the complex would not renew Howard under the same arrangement. He could not qualify for the 2-bedroom unit independently. Danielle and Brielle were unauthorized occupants, and the account had unresolved charges. They received proper notice and time to relocate. Howard told relatives I had arranged an eviction, but the paperwork showed otherwise. The following Monday, Howard appeared at my workplace. Heritage Axis occupied 2 floors of a renovated downtown building. He entered reception and demanded that I restore the transfer and call the leasing office while he watched. My supervisor, Elena Ruiz, asked him to leave. Howard raised his voice and said the company should know what kind of daughter it employed. Elena contacted building security, and he was escorted out. Before leaving, he pointed through the glass and said I was proving Danielle right about successful people becoming arrogant. That afternoon, I sent formal no-contact notices to Howard and Danielle by certified mail. Nolan blocked both numbers from Ethan's phone after Danielle messaged him that he had ruined Brielle's life. Howard also called Ethan directly and asked him to convince me to act like family. Involving my son ended any remaining uncertainty. I saved the messages and warned that further direct contact with Ethan would be documented as harassment. June and the school office received a copy of the restriction because Howard had already shown that embarrassment would not stop him from appearing uninvited. 2 nights later, an unknown number left one final voicemail. "You think you won, Mallory. Howard said, "but one day you'll regret losing your family." I saved it and blocked that number too. By the end of summer, none of us were living the lives Howard had expected. He left the two-bedroom apartment when the lease ended and rented a furnished room from a retired coworker in Grove City. He took limited shifts at a hardware store to cover the difference between his pension and expenses. His life became tighter, but he was not abandoned or helpless. He simply had to live within the resources he actually had. Danielle moved with Brielle into a smaller apartment. She sold her newer sport utility vehicle, purchased an older sedan, and began making the court-ordered payments. Brielle started school counseling and lost unsupervised access to expensive electronics until she demonstrated better judgment. I learned those facts through court records and one neutral relative, my Aunt Marlene, who never carried emotional messages between households. I did not reopen contact. In September, Howard mailed me a thick envelope. On the front, he wrote, "About family reconciliation." Nolan asked whether I wanted to read it. When I turned it over, I saw another note. "I also need help with the room deposit." That sentence explained the letter more clearly than anything inside could have. I marked it, returned to sender, and mailed it back unopened. There was no private family meeting, no restored rent, and no agreement built around another promise that things would change later. Several months after the birthday, Ethan's documentary was selected for a regional student exhibition. June introduced the project in a small theater filled with families, teachers, preservation volunteers, and local historians. Ethan's film followed 3 neighborhood buildings that adults had dismissed as replaceable until the people connected to them explained what would disappear with the walls. In the final section, he connected buildings to personal possessions. Adults sometimes minimized a child's interests because an object could technically be replaced. But replacement did not erase the disrespect or the message that the child's attachment mattered less than adult convenience. He never named Brielle, Danielle, or Howard. He did not need to. The audience remained silent through the final credits before applauding. Ethan received recognition for emerging documentary storytelling. After the program, June showed us the judges' notes. They praised Ethan for refusing to turn the film into a speech about revenge. Instead, he had asked a harder question. Why do people protect peace only when the person causing harm is challenged? Ethan said he had learned that silence could look calm while still rewarding the wrong person. Nolan squeezed his shoulder and told him that lesson would matter far beyond photography. We celebrated with burgers at a diner near the theater. There were no tense phone calls, no relatives demanding explanations, and no need to measure every happy moment against someone else's jealousy. Watching Ethan laugh over a milkshake, I understood that boundaries had not destroyed our family celebration. They had finally made an honest one possible. Afterward, he told me losing the first camera had not been the deepest injury. The worst part was hearing everyone act like my feelings mattered less because you could buy another one, he said. I told him replaceable property still deserved respect, and no child should have to accept mistreatment to preserve adult peace. He asked whether I missed Howard and Danielle. I miss who I believed they were, I answered, but missing someone does not make them safe. That was the difference I had failed to understand for years. Grief was not an obligation to reopen the door. Loving relatives did not require financing their refusal to change. We remained permanently out of contact. The transfer stayed canceled. Danielle's court payments continued. Ethan kept making films, and our home became quieter in a way I once mistook for loneliness, but later recognized as peace. I did not cut my father off because of one camera. I cut him off because the camera exposed what my money had been hiding. I had spent years paying to keep the family together, but all I had really done was make favoritism affordable. That ended the night he stood outside my door.
We hope the story gives you both entertainment and something meaningful to think about. This is a fictional narrative created only for dramatic storytelling and educational value. We hope it reminds you that not every person who loses you deserves a way back into your life. Some doors close because keeping them open would only allow the same pain to return in a different form.